Well, hello, everyone. My name is Ann Kinseth. I am the Director of Education at the Meadows Museum in Dallas, Texas. Thank you so much for joining us today for our online program. Further Afield is the Meadows Museum's virtual lecture program, which provides a broad social, political, economic, and historical context for works of art on view at the museum. And this spring, in conjunction with our current exhibition, which is titled In the Shadow of Dictatorship, Creating the Museum of Spanish Abstract Art, the Further Afield series focuses on art, culture, and life in Francoist Spain. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who joins us from California, Luis Martín-Cabrera. Luis Martín-Cabrera is an associate professor in the Department of Literature at the University of California, San Diego, as well as affiliated faculty in the Department of Ethnic Studies, the Critical Gender Studies program, and the Center for Iberian and Latin American Studies. In addition to all of that, he is also the director of the Spanish Civil War Memory Project, which is an initiative to collect testimonies of the victims of human rights violation in Spain during the war and the ensuing dictatorship. He holds a BA from the University of Salamanca in Spain, an MA from Yale University, and a PhD from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. A specialist in Spanish and Latin American cultural studies, Martín-Cabrera's research focuses primarily on the relationship between culture and politics. He is the author of 2 books, Radical Justice, Spain and the Southern Cone Beyond Market and State, and Invisible Insurgencies, Activism and Resistance in the United States, as well as numerous articles and contributions to alternative media outlets. So it is my pleasure to now turn the presentation over to Dr. Martín-Cabrera for a talk that he has titled The Spanish Civil War Memory Project.
Thank you, Anne. It is my pleasure to be here today to talk to you about the Spanish Civil War Memory Project. I just sent a link for you to see the digital side of the archive that you can visit and stream some of the testimonials. There will be soon subtitle on a different site, and if you want to know more about it, you can always email me. So let me just share my screen. And I want to start by showing you the website of the project. You know, you have a description in there. What we did actually from 2007 to 2010 is to interview people that were either victims of fascist violence during the Spanish Civil War and the Francoist dictatorship, or witness of that fascist violence. I took several teams of graduate students to Spain. We went to different cities, Barcelona, Seville, Madrid, and many other smaller towns, and we joined forces with different civic associations, such as the Association for the Recuperation of Historical Memory, and others. So I'm going to just try to give you a little bit of background of the Spanish Civil War and the dictatorship, and show you what's the role or where these testimonials are inserted in the debate over the recuperation of memory and the politics of memory in Spain. So I'm going to change now to my PowerPoint. See. Oh. Okay. So if I were to tell you what's the origin of this digital archive, I will have to look at this picture. This, believe it or not, is me when I was 2 years old. And this is my grandmother, the late Agustina Garrido. And if you believe, like me, that there is such a thing as intergenerational transmission and mandates that are, different types of mandates that happen unconsciously, what I believe she was telling me there is like, dig, grandchild, because there is something in the family history that needs to be uncovered. If we fast forward to when I was 7, I grew up in a household with her, and every 31st of December in New Year's Eve, she refused to celebrate. As you probably know, in Spain, when it's midnight, we ate 12 grapes for good wishes for the new year, and so on and so forth. And my grandmother was always absent, and she was always sad. So when I asked, why is grandma not celebrating with us, I was told to shush and to not ask any questions, or that at worst, and at best I was told she's sad because of something that happened during the war. Don't ask any questions. Of course, the worst thing you can tell to a 7-year-old or 8-year-old is to not ask questions. Since that very moment, I never stopped asking questions about that past. And I came to find out that my grandmother refused to celebrate because that night of December 31st on 1936, her brother, her uncle were executed by the Francoist forces just because they were socialists, just because they believed in the Spanish Second Republic. So that was my first lesson in memory. She taught me that even a woman completely disempowered like her could perform this very small act of memory and refuse to forget her brother and her uncle that were unfairly executed just because of their political ideology, and sometimes also for a small, economic interest, and I can elaborate on that. The interesting thing is that until the year 2000, I didn't know that my story was shared by thousands and thousands of Spaniards, because this is something that was either not discussed in the families, or if it was discussed, you thought that it was something that occurred during your family, or there was no public space to share these kinds of stories. What happened to people who were executed and often buried in unmarked mass graves, or how it happened. There was fear, and there was no space to share all of that. So that's my story. That's how I came to talk so many years later to you about the Spanish Civil War and memory in Spain. Because I don't know how much you know about the history of those years, I'm gonna start with a brief historical introduction to the Spanish Second Republic and the Spanish Civil War. And then I will walk you through the war with a map, with a story map, and show you the relationship between the war, the repression, and the role that the testimonials that we have collected play in the construction of that memory. So, Spain is a country in Southern Europe, as you probably know, and one of the ways in which we can describe the Spanish history in the 20th century is by saying that it's a country that had an uneven modernity. I don't mean by this that it was backward or less developed than France or Germany, but I rather mean that it was a country where, like, for instance, the southern part of Spain was mostly the economy was predicated in agriculture. There were like big extensions of land in a few hands. Industrialization was reduced to a few enclaves, in Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Madrid. The separation of church and state was not fully accomplished by the 1930s. And so by 1931, the Spanish Second Republic tried to fast forward and to push forward a process of modernization that was uneven up until that moment. That process was interrupted in 1936. There was a coup d'etat. The war lasted 3 years. I'm giving you the main dates so to situate you on the problem. In 1939, the forces of Francisco Franco, who was a close ally of Benito Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany, won the war. And then we had the dubious privilege of having in Spain the longest dictatorship in Europe from 1940 to 1975. In 1975, on November 20th, the dictator passed away. And then a transition to democracy began from 1975 to 1978, which is when the constitution that is in force right now was approved. But I put a question mark in there because many of us believe that that transition has not been fully accomplished yet. And I will explain to you why. Until 2007, what happened during the war and the dictatorship was hidden. There was, it was something that was discussed at best within the families. But in the year 2000, the Association for the Recuperation of Historical Memory and Emilio Silva, his president, exhumated a mass grave of political prisoners that were executed during at the dawn of the war. And that paved the way for the approval of the law of historical memory, which is the first government recognition of the genocide that took place in Spain during the war and the dictatorship. Our project, as you can see there, is inserted, in between from 2007 to 2010. We were collecting these testimonials. We basically joined forces with these civic associations and inserted ourselves in the process of giving voice to those who were voiceless for, decades, since the end of the war to the years 2000. Okay. Another part, as you might have read recently, Franco was finally exhumated from the Valley of the Fallen in 2019. So my point is that this process of wrestling or dealing with the memory of the dictatorial past is ongoing, is open-ended. It continues to happen. I'll tell you more about where he was buried in a minute. So how do we arrive to the Spanish Second Republic, which is the sort of the point of departure of this summary of Spanish history? This is a map of the municipal elections of 1931. And as you can see, in 1931, Republicans, and by the way, Republicans in the Spanish context almost mean the opposite that in the US context. Republicans were those who opposed the monarchy and the traditional sectors of society. So they were liberals, socialists, social democrats, in some cases, communists and anarchists as well. But you can see, so Republican means we don't want a monarchy, which is another vestige of, a traditional society. And so you can see how in Barcelona, Girona, in these areas that, they got a strong support, and in areas that are more agricultural like these, the monarchists won. But there was a huge victory on the elections of 1931 that paved the way for the declaration of the Spanish Second Republic on April 14, 1931. And it almost happened, people took to the streets and declared the end of the monarchy, and Alfonso XIII decided to leave Spain, and that led to the proclamation of the Spanish Second Republic. And right away to the writing of a new constitution that was very, very advanced. You can see the preamble of the constitution there. Spain is a democratic republic of workers of all classes, which is organized in a regime of freedom and justice. This flag is the flag of the Spanish Second Republic. The flag that we have today, the red, yellow, red, is the flag of the monarchy. And as you know, we have a king still in Spain. But in 1931, and she represents this new republic, this new democratic republic outside of the purview of the monarchy, But this flag has been, after the Spanish Civil War, replaced again by the monarchical flag. You can see, this is an image of Madrid, the day of the declaration of the Spanish Second Republic. You can see the happiness, the outburst. This has been colored, by the way. This is something people are doing now. They are sort of like coloring the picture so that we have a closer feel to what it might have been like to be in Madrid on April 14, 1931. And right away, there were elections, and, a coalition of, the coalition of government was formed by socialists and Republicans. Again, remember that Republicans here should read like Democrats or liberals in the context of the United States. And they tried to do in 2 years what, Spanish politicians couldn't do since the 19th century, to make the country fully modern. There was an issue with lack of access to the land, so they passed an agrarian reform in 1932. They expropriated a lot of land from, that was in the hands of the nobility or the church and distributed it among the poor peasants in the south. There was an educational reform, like 50% of the population in Spain back at the time was illiterate. They built 10,000 schools in these 2 years, like 8 times more than in the entire first part of the 20th century. The Spanish constitution declared the separation of church and state, declared, that Spain was a laic state. The Jesuit order was dissolved. They passed a law of divorce, a law of religious congregations. This is one of the things that probably alienated many Catholics because they prohibited public expressions of religiosity in the public sphere. So for Eastern, all of these processions were banned, we can discuss now how, how appropriate that was, but they were trying to, the church, the Catholic Church had a lot of influence, in public affairs, and they wanted to separate them from the state. They closed the military academy of Zaragoza. They forced into retirement many anti-democratic military officers. They did this because the military in Spain had a tradition of staging coup d'etats and intervening in public affairs. So they were trying to sort of pass the most reactionary military officers into retirement to avoid another coup d'etat, although they were clearly unsuccessful. And they granted the government of Catalonia autonomy, an statute of autonomy in 1932. As you might have heard also in the press, this problem that was on the way of being resolved in 1932 is still lingering, and we have had, recently a conflict between the Spanish state and Catalonia. In 1934, there were elections again, so you can see that it was a period of high instability, and then center-right and parties were elected. There was a coalition of Catholic and conservative politicians. This is the first election in which the women have the right to vote. I'm not connecting one to the other. I'm saying that there was also a feminist wave, looking for to acquire rights for women who were until that moment pretty much marginalized from the public sphere. And the program of the center-right can be summarized by saying that they basically, as soon as they were elected in 1934, they decided to undo all the reforms from the previous period. So they stopped the agrarian reform, they stopped the educational reform, they gave power back to the Catholic Church. And, in response to this sort of reactionary, this wave of reactionary politics, the unionized mine workers staged a general strike in Asturias in the north of Spain in 1934. And the response of the government was to bring Francisco Franco, who at the time was just an unknown general, and the army to repress the striking miners. So you can see how we are walking towards polarization, increasingly towards polarization. In 1936, again, there were elections because the coalition of parties didn't have enough support. You have a 72% of participation, and we have what is called in history here the politics of the front. Pretty much the political field is divided into two fronts. On the one hand, the Popular Front that included socialists, Republicans, and communists that obtained 47.2% of the vote. And on the other side of the political spectrum, the National Front with the CEDA, which included monarchists. Carlists are supporters of King Charles, and pretty much represent a more conservative and traditional version of the monarchy than the Bourbons. They obtained 45.6% of the vote. So you have by February of 1936, you have a country that is showing increasing signs of polarization. On July 12, 1936, a Republican, liberal lieutenant is assassinated, Teniente Castillo. And then the next day, Calvo Sotelo, the leader of the conservative opposition, is assassinated as well. It should say July 13, sorry about that. These two assassinations are taken as, a sign, or they are usually credited to being like the prelude of the Spanish Civil War, which happened finally on July 18th of 1936. Junta militar that included these generals that you have in there, Mola, Sanjurjo, Franco, and Queipo de Llano, staged a coup d'etat that was only successful in some parts of the country. So this is important. You can see here in 1936, so these are the Republican forces. They were holding Madrid, how it was only successful here in July, but right away in March, this is how the Francoist fascist forces are advancing, right, up until 1939. This is important because often when I'm going to talk to you about mass graves and political executions, they didn't happen in the war front. They happened in areas that were already pacified and under control of the Francoist fascist forces. I'm going to try now to show you a map. Story map. Okay. Bear with me. One second. Okay. Okay. All right. It should actually, I put a map tour of war and repression, but I should really say a tour of war and genocide, because and this is what I want to argue, it's a controversial point, and I'm happy to discuss it. I think the Spanish Civil War is a misnomer, because what happened, yes, there was a war between two factions, the democratically elected government of the Republic and the military rebels, the military fascist rebels. But at the same time, as the military rebels were advancing, there is also a genocide, an attempt to exterminate political enemies, right? And I think that has been, uncovered recently. So, but before I make that argument, I want to show you where Francisco Franco, who came to be the dictatorship later for 40 years, from 1940 to 1975, he was here in the Canary Islands. I don't know if you know that Spain has these islands, across from Morocco, and Western Sahara. It's a colonial possession, but it's Spanish territory. And he was there because the Republican authorities, the democratically elected government, knew that he didn't have much appreciation for democracy. So they were trying to stop him from staging a coup or doing anything like that. So on July 18, 1936, and there's a group of businessmen, including the owners of the newspaper ABC, that paid for a plane to take him to here, to Tangier and to near Melilla and Ceuta, two other colonial possessions of Spain in North Africa. And the reason why that was important is because in the 1930s, Spain, the most qualified part of the Spanish army was in Northern Africa, because this part of Morocco was still a Spanish colonial possession. These troops were trained into exterminating, the local native population. So they were the better trained, and they were also the ones that had participated in colonial genocidal politics. So Franco flies to here on July 19, and then with the support of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, he arrives to Seville on July 30, 1936. These two things are key, having control of the Spanish colonial army in North Africa and the air support of, the German aviation and the Italian aviation are one of the reasons why he was able to, Franco and the military rebels were able to win the war. And here is the thing, as they were advancing, So this is August 15, 1936, very successfully, south to north, you can see it here. So they are going south to north. Not only, so there is the war, they are conquering this territory, but they are also enhancing an extermination of all those people who had any real or imagined connection to the Spanish Second Republic. So if you received a socialist newspaper, if you were part of a union, a trade union, if we interview people that were arrested because they were dressed up as the Spanish Second Republic or had a Republican flag, they proceed to clean, quote unquote, these enemies of Spain or Catholic traditional Spain because they presented a threat to the well-being of the nation. And so as they were there were problems to know what was going on. But in this case of Badajoz, of the massacre of Badajoz, a journalist from the Chicago Union Tribune traveled from Lisbon to Badajoz and was able to document what they were doing. And I just want to read you a piece of how he was describing in his chronicle what was happening in Badajoz. So this is from the article originally published, on August 25, 1936 in Chicago. This is the most painful story it has ever been my lot to handle. I write it at 4 o'clock in the morning, sick at heart and in body, in the stinking patio of the Pension Central, in one of the tortuous wide streets of this steep fortress town. I could never find the Pension Central again, and I shall never want to. I have come to Badajoz several times, several miles away in Spain. I have been up on the roof to look back. There was a fire. There are burning bodies. 4,000 men and women have died at Badajoz since General Francisco Franco's rebel foreign legionaries and Moors climb over the bodies of their own death through its many times blood-drenched walls. I tried to sleep, but you can sleep on a soiled and lumpy bed in a room at the temperature of a Turkish bath with mosquitoes and bedbugs tormenting you, and with memories of what you have seen tormenting you, with the smell of blood in your very hair, and with a woman sobbing in the room next door. So this gives you a very vivid description of the kinds of atrocities that Franco's army was committing. Another example, and there are many, when they took Malaga, was as the Francoist forces were approaching Malaga, people, like you can see, this is a picture, were escaping, from Malaga to the west, to the areas that were in control of the Spanish Second Republic and the democratically elected government. And the Italian planes, were bombing them as they were, those are civilians trying to reach to another town, and they were being bombed, they were being arrested, and they were being executed. So very recently, in 2007, one of the historical associations in Andalusia discovered a mass grave with 4,571 bodies of people executed between 1936, and even all the way to 1955. Some of them were people who were executed during the desbandada, during the escape from Malaga to the west, to the east part of Spain, and all that. And all of that was uncovered. No one knew that these mass graves were there. Just for context, everybody knows about the 30,000 disappeared in Argentina, the 3,000 in Chile. In Spain, we don't have a final count, but there are probably close to 300,000 people who are lying in these mass graves, and we have only recuperated a few. So you can see why I'm saying that there was a war, but there was also a genocide. And before you ask me this, I should tell you that there was violence on the other side, but it was never systematic, And the difference is that the Spanish Republican government always condemned, the extrajudicial executions or the violence that was not directed at winning the war, And also, we can talk about that if you want, but in terms of quantity, there is no comparison. Anyway, So by October 1937, Franco has arrived to Salamanca, where he established, his headquarters. You can see a demonstration here in the Plaza Mayor of Salamanca, and you can see a lot of people making the fascist salute, in case there were any doubts of the connections between Franco and Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And what we're going to see is just the revenge of those who were associated with the fascist side of the war, and the need to uphold the fascist ideals of Franco. By 1937, they established government here in Burgos. You're probably familiar with Guernica. This is the first time. By now, unfortunately, we have grown used to planes bombing the civilian population. Is happening right now in Ukraine and other places in the world, in Yemen as well. But Guernica was the first time in modern times that military planes bomb and actually wipe out an entire city. Those were Nazi planes that were acting in collaboration with the Francoist forces. So you probably know Pablo Picasso's Guernica, who he painted it after seeing the pictures that I show you. And I'll show you very briefly a clip of people commemorate, Spain is a country full of wounds. One of them is the memory of this, the destruction of Guernica. So let me show you just a close video.
This is not just a deck of cards. This is a collection of...
I didn't want it to do that. Sorry.
The northern Spanish town of Guernica has been commemorating the 80th anniversary of the deadly bombing that inspired Pablo Picasso to paint a masterpiece. More than 1,500 people were killed and hundreds wounded when German warplanes devastated the city in support of Franco's nationalist forces during Spain's civil war. This was a city, and these were homes like yours. Madrid's Reina Sofia Museum is also marking the anniversary with an exhibition dedicated to Picasso's blood.
So you can see how the memory of these events is still pretty much alive. There's people commemorating the anniversary, of what happened in Guernica. By 1939, we are approaching the end of the war. The fall of Barcelona happened on January 26, 1939. And again, you see the images of destruction and the fascist salute. Again, what is happening more and more is the elimination from public life, the physical, psychological and cultural elimination of anything that had any connections to the Spanish Second Republic or the progressive politics that it came to represent. Again, in Madrid, in 1939, March 28, we're coming to the end of the war. You can see the destruction, people escaping. And then I don't know, let me see. One of the very last towns is Alicante. People flew from Madrid to Valencia and then to the port of Alicante. And you can see the boats with refugees, hopping in and trying to avoid repression. One of the things that the Spanish Civil War Memory Project does is to bring, a lot of these things have been documented in the archives, in the historical archives. But what the Spanish Civil War Memory Project does is to bring first-person accounts of these events, sort of like the inner emotional history of these moments. It does have, also information and facts, but, something that I think is pretty unique when you put front and center the people who were there, the witness or the victims, although I don't really like the word victim that much. So this is Carmen Arrojo. She's actually the first person we interviewed. I still remember very vividly. And she was here in Alicante at the end of the war. So I want you to hear what she has to say about those last moments of the war. This is a video from the collection.
Decían que iba a llegar un barco, sí, ha ido barco. Los ingleses no dejaron llegar barco ninguno. Y allí fue un espectáculo horrible. Mira, gente que se suicidaba. Al lado nuestro, un hombre se cortó el cuello con una navaja barbera.
De desesperación. Porque no llevaban barcos.
Y de terror. Y de terror. Iba con dos chiquitas, hijas suyas, que una tenía unos 15 años y otra pues más pequeña. Y delante de las dos criaturas. Luego, cuando yo fui a tirar la pistola mía al mar, porque dijeron que las teníamos que entregar ya cuando se acabó todo el cacao, yo dije que yo no lo entregaba y fuimos mi novio y yo a tirarla al mar. Y cuando volvíamos, vimos un hombre que venía corriendo, se tiró al mar y se ahogó. Porque fíjate, estábamos en la parte donde iban los barcos de guerra, que había un calado tremendo de profundidad. No pudimos hacer nada por él. Allí se nos ahogó delante de todos. Era horrible. Era una mezcla de sacos de lentejas y de personas como no te puedes imaginar. Era todo lo que veías. Y para remate, la noche antes del día 1 de abril, fueron los fascistas de Alicante y nos querían matar, ametrallar. Pero tuvimos la suerte de que los italianos, de los cuales yo no puedo hablar mal, porque los italianos hicieron la cosa de Málaga que fue bestial, pero con nosotros luego se portaron muchísimo mejor que los españoles.
Es lo que están desenterrando ahora una fosa ahí en Málaga, por lo visto, de los italianos.
Pues sí, pues se portaron muchísimo mejor que los españoles. Te lo digo por experiencia propia. Porque sacaron las tanquetas de ellos, rodearon toda la parte del puerto de Alicante para que los falangistas no pudieran entrar a matarnos. Y así nos salvaron. Porque hasta que el último día ya habíamos estado bajo la protección de la embajada argentina. Pero por la noche cogieron los fascistas y iban ya porque estaban mirándonos, iban armados y lo tenían ya preparado. Lo estaban preparando, pero los italianos se enteraron antes y lo pudieron evitar.
So you can see how the Italian fascists protected actually those refugees. So because the Francoist forces were more violent and vicious, and they would have probably exterminated all of these people, and also the desperation, right, of people trying to escape or committing suicide before leaving, and so on and so forth. So what happened at the end of the war is not peace, is how half of Spain imposed its will and its political ideals on everybody else. And the epitome of that type of vengeful politics is the Valley of the Fallen. If you have ever been to Madrid and you go out to the north or the west, you're going to see a huge cross, 150 meters tall, actually. And this is where Franco was buried until 2019. Supposedly, it was built as a monument for, forgiveness and reconciliation and so on and so forth. But in reality, it was a labor camp. Franco took political prisoners in there and forced them to war in this huge mausoleum that he built for himself. He also took the remains of Republicans that were laying in like unmarked mass graves and buried them there, And here we have the privilege of interviewing one of the people who were in this camp, Claudio Sanchez Albornoz, a historian who managed to escape the labor camp and go into exile, and who was a professor of history at NYU until he retired, And this is a little bit of his testimonial to us in relation to the Valley of the Fallen. That is his take on the monument, quote unquote.
Que lo que tenía que haber hecho la última ley que se aprobó de memoria sobre la memoria histórica y que no lo ha hecho, es desenterrar a Franco y a José Antonio Primo de Rivera, entregar los cuerpos a las familias, que son los que los deben tener, y entonces todo el símbolo que rodea el llamado Valle de los Caídos, que yo nunca lo nombro así, sino con el nombre de Cuelgamuros, pues quedaría como un monumento aberrante construido en un régimen.
Patrimonio Nacional, Royal Custodian of State Property throughout Spain, welcomes you to Santa Cruz del Valle de los Caídos Memorial Monument.
On the 1st of April 1939, General Franco declared the armistice, ending the Spanish Civil War, himself becoming the new head of state. The war left behind.
So this was a monument that was maintained with the Spanish budget. You know, they took me when I was a primary school student. They used to take us there without explaining that was a labor camp, that people were there. So you can see Sánchez Albornoz proposing that they exhumed Franco, and José Antonio Primo de Rivera is one of the founders of the Spanish fascist party, Falange Española. And sure enough, and you can see the value of testimonials. I'm not saying that this happened because we interviewed Sánchez Albornoz, but that was in 2008. We fast forward to 2019, and you can see that finally the Spanish government of Pedro Sánchez decided to do what the former prisoners of the camp were requesting in the testimonial that I just showed you, which is to exhume Franco, the dictator, and return it to his family.
High, the helicopters descended to collect the remains of Francisco Franco. In life, he was known for his ironclad rule, who saw his own leadership as a Catholic crusade. In death, he became a relic of autocracy, a figure of times past, and a reminder of a troubling era. It was a monument to a man who dominated 20th century Spain, built on a site that holds one of the biggest mass graves in Europe. It became known as the Valley of the Fallen, constructed by the forced labor of political prisoners at the time. Franco's family had resisted the Spanish government's decision to move his coffin. But despite the pressure from right-wing groups, Spain's Supreme Court ruled that the exhumation had to go ahead.
Nos costó mucho deshacernos de un régimen. It took a lot to get rid of.
You get the idea. So what I'm trying to say is that in many ways, this collection, was ahead of its time. It was we archive and recorded things, and the views of people that were not being heard at the time, but that are coming, that are now being taken into account by the government, and they're doing things that, they were requesting back at the time when we were interviewing them. And so let me say I know I have talked for about 40, I'm going to say a few more things, and then I'm really interested in hearing what you have to say. So I'll say a couple of things very quickly to finish. Spain had a transition to democracy from 1975 to 1978. In 1977, the elites and the political parties decided that our model of transition was going to be one predicated on oblivion and impunity, meaning that we were not going to look back, that there were not going to be any commissions of truth, or let alone like trials or museums, that the best course of action was to look forward and forget and forgive what happened in the past. In 1977, they passed an amnesty law that specifically prohibited to judge anybody involved with human rights atrocities and violations. In the year 2000, I already mentioned that Emilio Silva, who at the time was like a relatively unknown journalist, went in search of his grandfather to Brianza del Bierzo in this area of Spain. And there were exhumations before, and I can talk to you about that, but that one has much more media attention. So he found his grandfather in this mass grave in El Bierzo, and he founded the Association for the Recuperation of Historical Memory. That, initiated a process of like hundreds of people like going out into the fields, in the small towns, looking for like their grandparents. This is pretty much my generation, the grandchildren and people younger than us, asking questions to our grandparents and demanding justice and demanding that the bodies that were lying down in unmarked mass graves be exhumed and returned to the families, right? You have to understand that this is done without government support. So it's just like civic associations of people who decided to come together and help a group of people to recuperate a grandma, a grandpa who was executed just because of his or her political beliefs, back in the 1930s. So what I'll give you a final example. There has been a law of historical memory in 2007. There is a new one now from 2019. Franco was exhumed from the Valley of the Fallen in 2019 as well. But there is still much to be done. There is still a lot of people who were responsible for these atrocities who have never been held accountable for what they did. And what we found when we interview people is an entire generation of Spaniards, our grandparents and older, that were left alone, with the pain and the consequences of the political mass extermination that the Francoist fascist forces carried out from 1939, actually, through the 1970s, but with more intensity during the war and the 1940s. They were left alone, with all of that pain and sadness, pretty much like my grandma, right? They couldn't talk about it. We found people who were still afraid. One of my uncles, I wanted to interview him, and he was afraid that people in our town could beat him up. That's what he said, because they beat him up in the 1940s just because he was related to a Republican family. So I can talk about a lot of the people we interviewed, but I chose this woman, Rufina Balbás. This is the mass grave of his father, Rufino Balbás. He was executed on August 18, 1936. When the students from UC San Diego went to interview her, she only agreed to the interview because the students happened to be Mexican American, and she remembered that Lázaro Cárdenas supported, the Spanish exile and accepted a lot of war refugees. And at that time, he had been looking for her father since August 18, 1936 to 2008. So I don't know how many years are those, but are many, many decades, And her father finally was exhumed. That's after the interview on 2010. This is Rufino Balbás. As many people, he just happened to have Republican sympathies. He was the secretary of a small town in the province of Burgos. So here is the testimonial of Rufina Balbás, his daughter. And I think it won't be very difficult for you to identify the signs of trauma after so many years, and the kind of pain that she had to endure during not only the dictatorship, but also a good chunk of the democratic period in Spain. So here is a fragment of her testimony.
Me decía el secretario, danos agua por mi padre. Digo, ya vosotros no os doy nada, que habéis matado a mi padre. Claro, la ignorancia de eso. Y dijeron, el próximo día la cortamos el pelo. Y se enteró mi hermano por el sacristán, que lo habían comentado los falangistas. Y entonces mi hermano cogió y me llevó, me puso en coche ese, allí escribió a no sé quién y me fueron a buscar a Burgos. Pero llego yo al pueblo ese y era de Falange el pariente donde me llevan. Y aparte del pariente, sufrí horrores en aquel pueblo, porque en cuanto cogían un pueblo, una ciudad o cualquier movimiento que ganaban por todos los sitios, vamos, digo yo por todos los sitios, por donde fuera, pues salían con antorchas dando la vuelta al pueblo. Y el pueblo era así, en línea recta, entrada y salida, y daban toda la vuelta al pueblo con antorchas. Y yo me veía a la cuadra es donde los animales, y allí veía a mi padre ahorcado, porque yo no me imaginaba cómo le habían matado, y yo veía a mi padre ahorcado, y así empezó la anemia que fui cogiendo, y la cosa esa hasta que enfermé, porque yo pasé los años de la guerra 2 veces en el hospital en Burgos. Una vez me operaron, que tengo la cicatriz en la tripa, todavía, porque decían que era tuberculosis de vientre.
So you can see clearly that they disappear her father, and then she's taken to another town, and she has to endure the arrogance and the aggressions of the fascist people who disappeared and killed, her father, and that led to hallucinations, to her body to getting sick, And you can see her, like how she remained all by herself. She never married. She became a nurse, and she devoted her entire life to look for her assassinated and disappeared father. Is, under these conditions, if you don't know what happened, what happens is that the task of mourning, the labor of mourning becomes open-ended. It's impossible to have any kind of closure. A lot of people on the right in Spain were telling us that we were doing the wrong thing, that we were opening wounds. But the problem, as you see in the testimonial of Rufina, is that the wounds could never be closed if you don't know where your father is, if you can have a proper process of mourning and have some kind of closure. So I was very happy to learn that Rufina found the remains of her father. That shouldn't be controversial at all. By the end of the interview, she said something that I think, and with this I will end, that to me exemplifies the kind of knowledge that you could find in our Spanish Civil War Memory Project in the testimonials. She said in passing, I don't read any books of the Spanish Civil War because why would I do that? I have enough with the book that I have inside of me. And that book is the history of how her father disappeared. And to me, the people we interview were forced to swallow that book. They were forced, pretty much like my grandmother, to keep that painful and violent and traumatic story inside themselves in a melancholic way, to preserve that knowledge. And if anything, I'm very proud that me and the graduate students that accompany me were able to rescue some of these books and preserve them at the UCSD Special Collection Library. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to thank you for bringing this very sobering history to all of us and for the work that you and your students at UCSD are doing. We have probably about 5 minutes for questions. So as a reminder, you're welcome to use the chat box to share any questions you have at this moment. We do have one to kick us off. Could you talk a little bit about the process of identifying the people you interviewed and what it was like to kind of convince them that this was something worth doing? Did you ever face challenges or pushbacks?
So we work with the organizations, there are these civic organizations that were doing this work on the ground. And part of the problem is that the Spanish universities and colleges were afraid of doing that in 2007, 2008. So typically these associations will have lists of people who were willing to speak. We didn't force anybody to speak. These were people that wanted to do it, that were waiting to do it. And I think even though I'm from Spain and I'm connected to the story and all that, the fact that we came from the University of California kind of was reassuring, but, you know, and provided a safe space for them to talk. You know, in many cases, or there's this story of this guy who was, you know, waiting for two of our students dressed up with a tie. And when they came to the town, he told them, I've been waiting for you 70 years. I knew you would come. So there was a very strong need to talk in some cases. In other cases, there was fear, you know, or unwillingness. But yeah, it was through the associations and training the students very carefully to hear these stories.
Thank you. We have we have several comments just thanking you for this wonderful presentation and for kind of the insight that you bring to this time period. Another question about Spain itself. Do you feel as though the country was more susceptible or vulnerable to kind of a fascist regime because they were used to having kind of the church or the monarchy or someone who was kind of in charge and more of an authority?
It's a complicated question, but I think so. You know, like I hope I'm not offending. You know, I have no problem with people being Catholic or anything like that, but the role of the institution in Spain was very detrimental. You know, they were an obstacle to progress, you know, and same thing with the monarchy. I obviously don't agree with the current king. You know, we have two kings now, the official one and the one who is retired. And I think what happened is that there was an elite of people, you know, like the landowners, certain members of the nobility, the industrial elite, in coalition with the church and the army, who were not willing to allow this process of democratization and modernization to unfold. And it's true that there was a long tradition from the 19th century to interrupt, you know, the few democratic periods, either to bring back the king or, you know, to bring the army to stop any kind of attempt to have a different arrangement of power. So that's definitely different. And I think this has been because the Catholic Church was so involved with Franco, that has led some historians, in my view, incorrectly, to say that Franco was not really fascist, that Nazi Germany and Italy were fascist, but Franco was not, just because of the Catholic element in this of the institution of the Catholic Church. But I think you can see that the kind of repression they unfold, I mean, I can go on and explain that. But yeah, I think, yes, that past history has some to do with that.
Thank you. I think just one final question, which is mine. I am wondering kind of what the future holds for this project. Is this active, or are you still actively collecting interviews? Has that closed?
It's closed because, you know, there was a great sense of urgency when we did it, because these people were 85, 90, 95, you know, so we knew we were coming late and that we have a very small window of time. We also didn't have enough funding to continue. You know, there was a point where no private foundation was interested. I mean, I'm very thankful to the Division of Arts and Humanities, our library. They support us all the way. But we ran, I mean, you could still interview, there's more people that you could interview, but we did it during that window of time. One of the students that came with me to Spain, Andrea Davis, she's now a historian, and she's translating, subtitling, you know, coding, and, you know, bringing the collection into the 21st century in terms of like the searchability. You know, she's using all the tools of like digital humanities, and it will be available soon, you know, in a new website. And so you can search by topics, and, you know, because again, we did this is why it has this quality. We recorded on HD, but now you have 4K, you know, like, so it looks like very old because the technology has advanced so much in 8 years. Yeah, The Silence of Others is a good movie. There are many other movies that deal with this. We're not the only ones, but we did this from a university institution. And within we have a large collection at UCSD that I invite you to visit as well, the Herbert Southward collection, Herbert Southward collection of, there are posters, like drawing of kids that were in camps, and our testimonials as well. I'm happy to stay for 5 more minutes. I don't know, Anne, if we can do that, or if people want to do it, I can respond a couple more questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, that's very generous of you. So any of you who are able to stay, I invite you to do that. So two things, I guess. First is just that I put the link to the archive again in the chat box so that it appears a little bit lower for those of you who didn't see it the first time. And then the second thing is another question that's come in. So can you see ways where this archive could be incorporated into curricula for, you know, maybe middle schools or secondary schools?
I think it should. Again, you know, what Andrea is doing, I think, will make it easier because it will have English subtitles, you know, and transcripts, and the searchability will improve, you know. I think it will be very important because it also, I didn't talk about the US in all of these, right? But they decided to support Franco in the 1940s, probably before, you know, because they wanted to install military bases. There are still military bases in Rota, in Torrejón de Ardoz, near Madrid. And that's why Franco was accepted into the United Nations in the 1950s, because it sort of like went along with the interest of the United States during the Cold War. So I think there is a lot to learn from US students here. That's the bad part. There is also a good part. Hundreds of US citizens came to Spain to support the Spanish Second Republic, you know, because they understood that it was sort of like the prelude of the fight against fascism in Germany and Italy in World War II. Many African Americans came to support us. We have a debt to all of them. You know, and it was the first time that African Americans and whites, you know, from the US served, you know, in an army in a non-segregated way. They fight side by side, you know, with Republicans, with whites, with Latin Americans. So I think not only college students, but middle and high school students will have a different look at World War II by focusing on the Spanish Civil War. Of course, we have Ernest Hemingway coming to Spain and writing For Whom the Bell Tolls. So I would be delighted. I went to schools and I spoke to high school students, and they're always really interested, and you know, it caught their attention. So yeah, I don't know how to do it. If anybody knows how to bring it to boards of education these days, that boards of education are so contentious, I would be happy to promote it.
Well, maybe we can end with one last question that's also kind of a big one. Do you think something like this could ever happen again in Spain?
Thank you, thank you so much for this question. Yes, you know that for the first time, we used to say that we didn't have extreme right or fascist parties in Spain, unlike what happened in France or Italy or the Netherlands. But now we have a party, Vox, who is very much, you know, they are very much defenders of the dictatorship, you know, and deniers of the violence that took place during the Spanish Civil War and the Francoist dictatorship. And, you know, it's obviously a modern phenomena. You know, they are more alike to Bolsonaro in Brazil or Trump in the US. But to me, you know, in a country that was devastated by the war and the ferocious repression that followed the war, one of the reasons why Vox, this political party and the kind of like hate speech that they promote is viable is because Spain didn't come to terms with the dictatorial past. It's the lack of institutional politics, the lack of memorialization, the lack of justice, the lack of an institute, we're taking steps, but the lack of coming to terms with that history is the fertile ground for new hate and for new extreme right. It's not extreme right, they are fascist, that's what we should call them. And it happens because we have no memory, no politics of memory. And I'll finish with this. I went to a high school in my town, Béjar, in the province of Salamanca. And, they asked me to speak about this. And so I asked them first, what do you know about the Spanish Civil War? Or tell me who is Franco and who were the Republicans. And it was so sad, because they said something, Franco was a bad guy, but then it was good. They don't even know the basics. Talk about, the US high school and middle school curriculum. The Spanish Civil War was never, ever taught, at schools. I think it has changed a little bit, but it's still not enough, And by the end of that talk, this is a very small town. So in the class, you have people who were on both sides, right? You have people who were the descendants of the repressors, and you have people who were the descendants of the victims. And I have some knowledge about who did what, because we interview people there too. And I knew I have both in the class. And so they asked me, why don't you tell us the names? Because I have refrained from telling them who did what. And then I said something like, look, you're not responsible for the kind of stuff that your grandparents did, or the reasons why they did it. But I think, we are responsible to know what happened and then put it out there and be able to talk to each other about how this shouldn't happen again. So I told them, and it was difficult, but they were able to come together and respect that and understand that, I didn't say this at the beginning, but the husband of that woman, of my grandmother, was a fascist. So I have both sides on my own family, and he silenced her for many years, But I think these conversations are difficult, but they need to happen if we want a better future. That's what I would say.
Well, thank you so much again for really such a lovely presentation. I think we're all going to leave this with a lot to be thinking about. So thank you, and thank all of you for joining us today. We hope to see you again. We have 2 more Further Afield talks this spring, also dealing kind of with this era. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.